So today is May the 4th, which means today is May the 4th be with you, but tomorrow is Cinco de Mayo. And while we can't provide hors d'oeuvres for you, no queso and chips, no margaritas, if you have your own or have a glass of wine or have a glass of clear water, no Montezuma's Revenge, we'll talk a little bit about the history of Cinco de Mayo and then talk a little bit about Maximilian I, the Emperor of Mexico, and then a little bit about Napoleon III of France, who's one of my favorite historical figures because I tend to like folks who are somewhat confused. I sort of empathize with them, and he is absolutely fascinating. Most all of you, if you're not aware of it, are aware because Napoleon III, who will come to the throne in France in 1848, as a result of the revolution that is depicted in Les Mis. I think most people think that the revolution in Les Mis is the revolution that occurs when Napoleon Bonaparte comes to the throne, but it's not. It's actually about 3.5 revolutions after Napoleon Bonaparte. But we'll talk about Louis Napoleon III in a little bit, but let's talk a little bit of Mexican history because it seems like an appropriate day to do that so that we will be fully versed and ready to celebrate tomorrow, however you would like to celebrate. So let's talk about why the holiday of May the 5th is important in history in our southern neighbor here in North America. So let's think back. As always, there's a backstory. So, there's that prologue that you read before you get into the real story. So let's think back to North American Hemisphere history and think a little bit about the fact that you go back to the 13 colonies, you go back to the settling and the exploration periods, you go back to the founding of the Canadian provinces, and you look at Central America, including Mexico as the largest of the states. And I think we realize that history is a history that is dominated by 3 European powers, and that's the British, the French, and the Spanish. The Spanish having made first landfall here because they were the earliest of the explorers, motivated primarily because they were able to use some of the scientific advancements. Prince Henry the Navigator, the Portuguese very early on, but the Spanish, because they are there so close, very quickly usurp those navigational tools and are able to explore. But if you fast forward through, you know that ultimately in that story, the British become the dominant power in North America. And that's true with the establishment of the 13 English colonies in what today is the United States. But it's also true when you look at Canada, because the French were in Canada really first, or had the strongest stronghold in Canada, in central Canada, and what today would be Quebec, Ontario even. Those were early French settlements also. But after the American War for Independence, after the French and Indian War, in which the French will be defeated on the Plains of Abraham when Montcalm will be killed there, as will Wolfe. Ultimately both of the leading generals will die in that conflict. But what you end up with is a Canada that is 93 or so percent English dominated, with the French maintaining control of Quebec City, but with the seat of government eventually going into Ontario and Ottawa becoming ultimately the capital. But even in that early history, so the French are driven out of Canada, they're driven out of the Ohio River Valley after the French and Indian War, and then certainly after the War for American Independence. The treaties and everything will drive them out of that. I think we sometimes forget too that truthfully the Spanish were the first on this northern hemisphere and established a stronghold in Florida. I think probably all of us have been to St. Augustine, the oldest city in North America, within what today would be the continental United States. And the Spanish also had been driven out, and that begins to occur in the early 19th century. You'll remember that in 1819, the United States buys Florida from the Spanish for a rather inconsequential amount of money, $15 million, primarily because Andrew Jackson had invaded Florida, chasing the Seminole and some of the other Indians, and had basically berated the Spanish and said he wouldn't have had to invade their country if they knew how to take care of their Indians. not a politically correct statement today at all, but ultimately the Spanish decided they might as well go ahead and sell Florida because they were pretty much going to lose it anyway. The other thing that you have to remember is that beginning in 1820 in Mexico with Father Hidalgo and the Mexican War for Independence, Mexico becomes independent, and that wave of revolution will spread across Central America into South America, so that, you know, Jose de San Martin and others will be revolutionary leaders in South America. So ultimately, while there's Spanish influence, Spain itself, its power had dwindled and they were driven out, as France had been driven out of the New World, except for a few islands in the Caribbean. So the Europeans, so we're going to fast forward to about 1860. And the Europeans have been looking for a second chance, those two Europeans in particular, to reinsert themselves in the Western Hemisphere. Now, why had they not done that? Primarily, they had not done it because of what John Quincy Adams had written as Secretary of State into the Monroe Doctrine during the Monroe presidency, early 1820s, that period of time when everybody was being sort of expelled from the Western Hemisphere. And the Monroe Doctrine had said two things that were really, really significant. It had said, one, no new colonies in the Western Hemisphere. The second thing it had said pretty clearly was no intervention in the internal affairs of nations in the Western Hemisphere. And the not so subtly implied third thing was, and if indeed European nations felt that it was in their best interest to attempt to do either number one or number two, that what would happen is that the United States, acting as a protectorate, would come to the defense of those smaller and less powerful nations in the Western Hemisphere. And that pretty much scared everybody. The United States, having defeated Great Britain by 1820, having defeated Great Britain, the most powerful nation on the face of the earth, in the minds of the Europeans anyway, during the American Revolution and then during the Second American Revolution, the War of 1812, pretty much no one was wanting to take a chance of engaging in conflict with the Americans. That just didn't seem to be a very smart idea on their part. So that's where we are. 1860 rolls around, and in 1860, you'll remember that in the United States, because it seems like whatever we talk about, we come back to the American Civil War because it's just such an overriding, it's the crucible almost for the United States. If those of you who loved chemistry and who loved firing that material, and if you loved, quantitative and analytical, and you wanted to separate the impurities from the pure and everything, well, the crucible for the United States, the crucible in many ways, was the American Civil War. So 1861, the president of Mexico is a guy by the name of Benito Juarez, and I think most all of you have heard of the town named for him, Juarez, Mexico. And Juarez is president of Mexico. It's 1861. The United States has just gotten itself entangled in an American Civil War. The Mexican government is in financial ruins, no money, no way to pay back debts, and they had a tremendous amount of debt that was owed to European nations that had been financing projects in Mexico. It was sort of a good place to invest money because there was lots of land, there were lots of natural resources, minerals, all of the legends of, the cities of gold and all those sorts of things. So a number of the European nations had invested substantial amounts of money in Mexico, and there were to be debts, reimbursements, repayments that would occur every 10 years. Well, Juarez has no money to repay them. So he defaults. He basically sends out a notice that says, I'm so sorry, we have no money, default on the debts. And in response, the European nations, who had sort of been waiting for an excuse to reestablish themselves in the New World, by this point, I guess not the New World, but in the Western Hemisphere, because the US is engaged in the American Civil War, Great Britain, France, and Spain all sent naval fleets to Veracruz. They are going to march into the capital city and demand reimbursement, if not in money, then in artifacts, in gold, in silver, and precious stones, and those sorts of things. So they land, they send naval cruises. Alden will be happy to know that it was the Navy they sent. So the Navy from all three countries lands at Veracruz, and Great Britain and Spain are able to negotiate sort of a settlement, an agreement to take some items now and then to wait for the economy in Mexico to stabilize. France, however, at this point is governed by Napoleon III, and Napoleon III refuses to negotiate with Mexico. In fact, he's sort of looking at the idea of a French empire, something that will be a legacy. Now, kind of a psychological side note to this, Louis Napoleon is Napoleon Bonaparte's nephew. He is the son of Louis Napoleon, one of Napoleon's brothers, and his mother is a sister to Josephine, who had been Napoleon's first wife. European family trees are just always so confusing. So anyway, Louis Napoleon, Napoleon III, is looking to recreate the French Empire. He has already, in 1852, had declared France to be an empire, primarily based on some territories they have in Africa and some of their Caribbean and South Pacific holdings. So he is already Emperor Napoleon III. And he's thinking, wouldn't it be nice to expand the empire to the New World? Mexico would make a good place to expand the empire. So he refuses to negotiate with Juarez. And instead, what he's going to do in 1861, again, a second French fleet will land at Veracruz, and they will unload a well-armed French infantry. And the infantry is going to march inland, and it forces Juarez to go into retreat. And Juarez and his generals will retreat because the French are so well armed. And remember, this is a bankrupt government, so munitions and things of that nature are just really difficult for them. Now, I'm going to say this, and this is a terrible thing to say, and those of you who love France can just go ahead and hiss and boo at me, but having taught European history for 40 years, the French historically struggle with carrying through with their military mandates. Is that a nice way of saying, they have trouble on the field? That's why today Napoleon is still rated as their number one figure in history, because it's the one and only time the French had a great chance at an empire. So anyway, what we have is Napoleon III announces basically that he expects that within 3 weeks the French will have defeated the Mexican forces. This is the nephew of my beloved little short, stubby Napoleon Bonaparte, who believed, remember, that he could leave with the French army of 1 million, march to Moscow, defeat the Russians, and be back in France during the spring. And that didn't happen. And in fact, he returns with less than 100,000 men, having lost 9 out of 10, which, any of you who are military experts will tell you that a 90% casualty rate, it's just unheard of. That's unheard of. So anyway, Napoleon III says, within just a few weeks, we will defeat the Mexicans. I have 6,000 troops there. And that's not exactly how it happens. Now, the war will rage on for a long time, but the battle that Cinco de Mayo comes from occurs in 1862. And what you have is a significant battle, but it's a little battle. But it's one of those turning point battles. It's sort of like when you look at the American Revolution and you say, Saratoga, although Saratoga is a big battle. Or you look at the American Civil War and you say, Antietam or Gettysburg as major turning points. Well, this battle will be this, and it's a little battle that occurs in a small town that's known as the Town of the Angels. And you have basically 6,000 French troops battling. Juarez is able to gather 2,000 of his Mexican troops. He comes back to the city. They're going to defend the city of the small city of the Angels. The French are going to lay siege to the city, and they begin this assault, and the battle breaks out on May the 5th of 1862. The battle will wage from daybreak until early evening, when the French are forced to retreat. They cannot take the small town. While they are significantly larger in force and better armed, and have more munitions, they simply cannot break the stronghold of that town. Now, part of that may have been, home front advantage, the passion of this is my land and my home, and that rising of the American spirits or whatever. But they're forced to retreat and to acknowledge that they've lost about 500 soldiers, while Juarez, out of his 2,000, has only lost less than 100. It becomes a hugely proclaimed victory over the French army. Now, it's a victory in a battle. It's not the winning of the war, nor is it even a turning point in what will ultimately occur in the war, but it's a huge moral victory. It's sort of like, for us, when we think about the war for Texas independence, and we look at the Battle of the Alamo, knowing that for us, even the Alamo it's a horrific occurrence. It's the massacre of our men who were within the Alamo, and yet it becomes the battle cry. It becomes a point from which we take moral courage to then go on to San Jacinto and to Goliad and to other future battles. Well, that's what this battle at the small town of the Angels will be for the Mexicans. So May the 5th becomes a date that will be celebrated because it is symbolic that this small country is able to defend itself against one of the more powerful nations in Europe. I mean, that's it's a David and Goliath kind of story. However, Napoleon III is motivated to continue keeping French forces there and to fight. So let's fast forward to June of 1863. So a year later, the French forces have been able to push into the center of Mexico, and they've taken the capital. And at that point, and it's an interesting story, Napoleon III is being encouraged by his empress, Eugenia, and Eugenia has sort of set herself up as the champion of Catholics everywhere. And part of what she wants is she wants this to be a moral victory. She wants it to be a religious victory. This is not just a military action, but in her mind, this is an attempt to save Mexico from what she believes is becoming a paganization of the Catholic faith, the blending of the Indian cultures, the mestizo cultures into the Catholic faith. She believes that they are losing the true Catholic faith, and she pushes Napoleon III to keep funding and keep pushing. And so they set themselves up as the Catholic protectors. Now, interestingly, once they take the capital of Mexico, they realize that the only way that France can successfully rule Mexico is there has to be some sort of a coalition government. That makes sense. So what they do is they choose 5 Mexican leaders, 5 men of leadership quality who are Mexican by birth and culture, and who agree to work in coalition with the French, and they set them up in basically a position that will be called a junta superior. They're going to be the 5 supreme military leaders in effect. Then those 5 military leaders are going to choose 3 men with political skills that they're going to create a triumvirate that will become the political leadership of Mexico. I mean, it makes you think back to the early days of Rome and the triumvirates, Lepidus and Crassus and Caesar and those situations through history. So 3 men in power, so that no one man becomes too powerful. 2 are, like the dual monarchy in Sparta, in ancient Sparta, then you've got conflict. So 3 sounds like it'll work. And then those 3 men working with the junta superior chose 215 leaders from across the Mexican states, the entire area of Mexico, and they will become the Assembly of Notables. Interestingly, the French Assembly at that point, what had been the oldest States General, was known as the Assembly of Notables. So they adopt that name from the French. So they've set up this coalition government where France is sort of in control, but they are using Mexican citizens to actually administer the government. seems like that would work. Well, in July of 1863, the Assembly of Notables issues an invitation with a suggestion having come from Napoleon III. They issue an invitation to Ferdinand Maximilian, who is a prince in the Austrian house, the Austrian royal family, who is a cousin to Napoleon III. And they issue him an invitation and ask if he will come to Mexico and will serve as emperor, along with his wife, who will be empress, the Empress Carlotta. And they then, if he will agree to do that, they agree they will change from a triumvirate to a regency. Regency being then Maximilian, who is an emperor, but really will be ruling regent for the French government, for his cousins in France. The invitation goes out in July of 1863. It takes Maximilian until April of 1864 to decide that he's going to do it. And there's a lot of negotiation that goes back and forth between the Austrian crown and Napoleon III, and Maximilian's trying to figure out what he's getting himself into. And remember that the royal family in Austria are also cousins to the royal family that had been in Spain. So this Ferdinand is a descendant of Ferdinand and Isabella. It just all gets so confusing, but so exciting. But anyway, he decides in April that yes, he'll take the crown. What could possibly be the downside? We're going to find out what the downside is in a few minutes. He arrives in Mexico in July of 1864. Now, what makes all of that really fascinating is he arrives and he actually is not doing such a bad job to start with. He's going in, he has decided that he's going to take some cues from his cousin, Napoleon III, and he'd like to be a fairly moderate emperor. So what does he do when he becomes emperor? And I made myself a real quick list so that I wouldn't leave out anything that's terribly, terribly important. But one of the first things that he does, because he knows from having studied European history, that one of the things that you need to do always is to make friends with the people that you've just defeated. That's a wise thing to do. So the very first action he takes is he offers political amnesty to anyone who may have been opposed to the French having a presence in Mexico, to him being offered the position as Emperor of Mexico, political amnesty to anyone who wants to join with the empire. And he will see that those who step forward and do that will not be punished. This is not a ruse to get them out so that he can execute them or whatever. They will not be punished, and they will be allowed to serve in the government. And it is incredibly successful. He does a really good job with that. He is also interested in reform. It's interesting. Maximilian, for all the fact that he's from the Habsburg royal dynasty, which is not given to being a great liberal body in European history, is a fairly reform-minded man. He has studied a lot of what's gone on in Britain with the Reform Bill of 1832 and then the actions in the 1840s and that little by little progressive movement that has occurred in Great Britain, where you have legislated liberalism as opposed to a revolution. Theirs is an evolution. And he thinks that's probably the best for Mexico. So he begins to reform all of the ministries. And then he begins to reform the army. He wants to do what he has seen work successfully in Britain and France, and that's an army based on merit, not necessarily on birthright leadership, but on those who've distinguished themselves on the battlefield. He then embarks on this goodwill tour of all of Mexico, and he visits all the major states. He meets with the local leaders. He even celebrates Mexican Independence Day with the Mexican states, celebrating when Father Hidalgo had led the revolution in 1820 that had gained independence. That's a little odd, I think, that I would have been afraid that I might have triggered some recollection in someone's mind and they might think, perhaps we should shoot him or something and get rid of him. But he does that. And then he makes a big boo-boo. And for all of us who love to study history, the issue of religion just always creates problems. So now remember, the Austrian Habsburg Empire, devoutly Catholic. The French are Catholic, but the French have, since the days of Henry IV in the, in the late 1500s, have been a little more tolerant. If you remember the War of the Three Henrys and Henry IV taking the throne, and then the Edict of Nantes, which allows the Protestants to worship. Maximilian makes a boo-boo in Mexico because he makes a proclamation in which he declares that Catholicism is the national religion, but they will practice religious toleration in Mexico. So other faiths are free to worship as they choose, being native faiths, and Protestants will be allowed to worship as they want to. And when he does that, he loses a lot of the support that he's had among those assembly of notables and others in leadership positions who consider themselves to be devout Catholics. They may not live by the letter and the spirit of the faith every day, but they are devoutly Catholic and they believe that what he's done is blasphemous. So he's in trouble. It was a great beginning, but it begins to fall apart. The other problem that occurs is that the US Civil War, he comes in 1864. You'll remember that by April of 1865, the American Civil War is over. And the United States, having just fought the most horrific war in our history, brother against brother, father against son, son against father, unbelievable expenditure in lives, money, emotional, everything, was not anxious to find itself launched into a war with France to sort of say, France, you have to get out of Mexico. So they do the next best thing. They begin very covertly, the United States government does, to send support to Juarez and his troops. There is a $30 million American private loan. That's money that comes from those who are wealthy that pool their money, and they loan $30 million to Juarez to fund arms and munitions, those things that he will need to be able to be victorious against the French. There are U.S. volunteers who will go south and will join Juarez's forces. They'll go across the border. There's no official direct intervention, although there is a wonderful copy of a letter from Juarez to President Johnson that is in the National Archives, or a facsimile of it at least is in the National Archives, in which Juarez asks to borrow Grant or Sherman one so that he can have two strong groups of, at that point, really guerrilla fighters who can then begin to wage war against the French. The U.S. government does not choose to get directly involved. I think it's kind of interesting to think about Grant or Sherman, either one having gone across the border. Of course, you'll remember that prior to World War I, of course, Pershing and American forces will go across the border chasing Pancho Villa. So, we go across the border when it fits what we need to be doing, but this does not fit with what we want to do. So Civil War breaks out even stronger in Mexico. You've got the French on one side, you've got Juarez and guerrilla warfare on the other side. And then Maximilian makes his second and his most fatal mistake. Maximilian signs a decree that says that any guerrilla fighter, because they are in revolt against the legitimate government of Mexico, any guerrilla fighter or anyone who gives support or refuge or aid in any form to any guerrilla fighter, they will be summarily executed upon capture. No trial, no anything. They will be executed. Even within Mexican history, as bloody as it had been with the series of military upheavals and juntas and all those sorts of things, no one had ever issued such a decree. It actually will be called the Black Decrees because it is seen as being so heinous. That's the turning point. At that point, even those who were Mexican who were supporting the French government, who had thrown their lot in and were living a fairly good life, will back away from Maximilian. Now, so what happens? You know, the Mexican support for the French. You know, remember they invited Maximilian to come and be their emperor, but they begin to back away from that because they see that bloody hand turning against their own people. Napoleon III reads the handwriting on the wall. 1866, Napoleon withdraws all of the French forces. Why Maximilian doesn't leave with the French forces, but he truly, by that point, and we can read his letters and his information, believes that he, and he is, but I mean, he truly believes he's the emperor of France. Now, Carlotta, his wife, does go back with the French forces, and she starts making the rounds in France, begging for support, you know, basically saying, you have left my husband there, you have left him without military support. What is going to happen to my beloved Maximilian? She begs for support everywhere. She gets the big fat no, 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 no. She goes to England, she goes to Belgium, she goes to all of those nations that have historically at times been allies of France, and nobody wants to get involved. Nobody wants, you know, they're concerned about making the United States angry because everyone's pretty much aware that the US is secretly, covertly supporting the Mexican rebellion. But at the same time, they're not anxious to fight a war that is an ocean away. Those are difficult wars to stage. They're difficult, you know, to supply, all those sorts of things. So Carlotta becomes so upset with all the refusals that she becomes insane. She will be hospitalized in Belgium in the middle of this tour, begging for money, and will live in an asylum in Belgium until she dies in 1927. Think about that. 1927, 9 years after World War I ends, Carlotta dies in the asylum. 1867, what happens is that the guerrillas, under the leadership of Juarez, capture Maximilian, and they issue their own Black Decree. He is captured, and along with two of his leading generals, they will be executed on the 19th of June of 1867 in Mexico. And, you know, you look at it as one of those stories that you so seldom hear when you study history in the United States, because we were so absorbed with what was going on with our American Civil War. 1867, we are still reeling, trying to recover from the Civil War. We're trying to put in place and actually put into effect the Civil War amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And most people, while the newspapers carried the stories of what had happened to the South in Mexico, simply were not interested in what was going on in Mexico. So real quickly, I'm looking to see, we're doing well on time. So let's talk just a little bit about Napoleon III, and then I'll hush and we can ask questions, or we can all phantomly, you know, toast each other, getting ready for the 5th of May. So Napoleon III is an interesting guy. He comes to power in 1848 as a result of what is the largest of the French revolutions. There had been a revolution, you know, Napoleon came to power, actually will be decreed emperor for life, you know, in that revolution that begins in 1789 on up through the Reign of Terror, then the Thermidorian reaction, and then Napoleon comes to the throne as emperor in 1802, serves until the fall of his empire in 1815, and then he goes off into exile and, you know, lives in St. Helena. There will be an attempt at a French Revolution in 1824. There will be a French Revolution in 1830 when Louis Philippe comes to the throne, the bourgeoisie king. He's in power for a while, and then in the minds of the French, he sells out to power and prestige and money. Then he comes out of power. And then the big revolution occurs in 1848, and that's when Louis Napoleon, who will become Napoleon III, comes to the throne. That's the, you know, Jean Valjean. Somebody surely can sing a good stanza of, you know, whichever song makes you cry the most. Mine is Bring Him Home. You know, that always makes me cry. But anyway, Louis Philippe comes to the throne in 1848, and he pledges that he will rule France. This will be a new France, and he is committed to restoring France as the most powerful nation in Europe, and he's not interested in power or any of those sorts of things until 1852. 1852, on the 50th anniversary, Christmas Day of 1852, Louis Napoleon, goes to the Notre Dame, just as Napoleon Bonaparte had on Christmas Day of 1802, and he declares himself to be Emperor Napoleon III. That 50-year historic connection. It's kind of like Madison and Jefferson dying on the 50th anniversary of signing the Declaration of Independence. So he becomes Napoleon III. Now, interestingly, there was never a Napoleon II. Napoleon II would have been Napoleon's young son by Maria Theresa of Austria, but he never comes to power. So he is, and he dies young, but he is never Napoleon II. But that within the French legacy had been held as that would have been Napoleon II. So he becomes Napoleon III. Comes to power, calls it the empire, and that's when he begins to look at maybe expanding the empire, moving more into Spain, taking some of the northern parts of Spain, the Basque territory, and some of those, which anybody in their right mind are going to leave the Basque alone, unless you haven't studied your history, and then they don't. But so that's why he's interested in going to Mexico, is to expand that empire. Now, he does do some good things. When we think of Paris today, city of the lights, broad boulevards, tree-lined boulevards, all the wonderful monuments, all of that's Napoleon III. If you will remember in Les Mis, how easy it was to barricade the streets, because the streets of France were these little bitty narrow, almost like we would today think of them as alleyways. And the sewers, remember the scene where, what's the young man's name, Marcus or whatever, where they're in the sewers hiding and all of that. That had played a role actually during the first French Revolution, when Marat is hiding in the sewers. Napoleon III is going to widen the boulevards. He's going to beautify the city. They're going to build all these wonderful monuments. In fact, the Arc de Triomphe is dedicated in honor of his uncle Napoleon Bonaparte. They begin to assemble art collections and great works of literature, libraries. They're going to clean the sewers. He's very interested, because there's a lot of information coming out in the 1850s and the 1860s about health and sanitation. So the French are going to get really big into healthy environment. He hires a German guy, and you'll recognize his name, Baron Haussmann, who will be in charge of this beautification of the city of Paris. And Paris will be the first to begin to have lights all through, which is why Paris becomes the city of lights. They will have gas lights all through all the new structures and everything. It becomes this beautiful. He spends a tremendous amount of money cleaning the Seine, so that the river becomes where all the tourists will come to, with all the new art galleries and, the welcoming of artists, the new movements coming into early Impressionism. Paris becomes the city everybody wants to go to once again. He, at the same time, preserves a lot of the medieval buildings, which much of Europe didn't do. A lot of those medieval buildings in other places were destroyed, but he sees and understands why it's important to preserve them. He will be the architect, or at least the visionary, for the French railroad system, because France is geographically much larger than I think we often think of. So he will be the one who will begin to fund the building of the French railroad. And because there was a period of time when he lived in Britain in the 1830s, that he is aware of the British Industrial Revolution. So it will be Napoleon III who will basically begin to industrialize France. France historically had been agrarian, wine, grapes, all those sorts of things, cheeses. Makes me hungry just thinking about it. But he will begin to industrialize, especially in the industries, steel and manufacturing. so that once France begins to industrialize, it will industrialize relatively quickly, never on the scale of Germany, certainly never on the scale of Great Britain, but they do begin an industrial power. And he recognizes that because of the vastness of the size of France, they need a banking system. And he gets his buddy, his good friend, the Baron James de Rothschild, to create the French national banking system, which is still in existence today. The Rothschilds do a lot of things really well. And so that banking system is in place. Now, what does he do badly? As so often happens with people who love the title of emperor or whatever, he begins to drink his own Kool-Aid. And by 1870, he has alienated a number of the other European leaders. He will find himself being suckered into a war with Prussia, the Franco-Prussian War. You know, France just needs to not fight Germany. I'm sorry. It never works well for them. It doesn't in the Franco-Prussian War. It doesn't in World War I. It doesn't in World War II. It goes so badly that in the Franco-Prussian War, Napoleon III will decide that he is going to lead the military, as his uncle Napoleon did. He is going to lead them into battle. He had actually not ever served in the military, but he had read a lot of good books. Yay for the libraries and yay for our librarians, but sometimes military experience is necessary. So he mounts his great stallion and he leads his men into the Battle of Sedan, Sedan, where he is captured by the Germans, and he will be paraded through the streets of Berlin as the captive French emperor, and it is the end of his empire. So 1870, we will have France changing governmental systems. Yet once again, the French write a new constitution about every 30 days for a period there until World War I. So anyway, we're going to, the French will have the French Commune. They will try all sorts of wonderful things, but Napoleon III is over. The war in Mexico has not gone the way that they wanted. The Mexican government is back free and in the hands of Mexicans. The United States is happy because France is out of the Western Hemisphere, except for Trinidad and a few places that are relatively inconsequential. And the world is back in a happy balance. And we need to celebrate all of that tomorrow by whatever is your favorite beverage, whether it is your French champagne or your Burgundies or your Mexican, since the French were defeated, some good Mexican beer or whatever you want, but you need to, or some tequila or whatever. You can tell I don't drink a lot of this stuff. I'm a wine girl. But it's a great day to celebrate that idea that the small can often defeat the mighty, that it's the will more often than it's just brute force. Independence is a heady wine in itself, and it motivates us to do and accomplish things that we might never think is possible, but we can. And for independence, people are willing to fight in a way they would probably not ever fight under any other circumstance. So Mexico celebrates that battle as its first major step toward independence and kicking the French out. And we will celebrate with them tomorrow. And that's the best I've done yet. It's 5:20. Yay! Yay! So unmute yourselves, folks, and talk to me. Tell me what you've got planned for Cinco de Mayo, other than a nap.
Nada.
I'm taking two friends to Gibbs Gardens. We hope we don't get rained on.
Oh, I hope you don't either.
We'll be back in time to have something Mexican. I don't know what it'll be.
And as much as we talked about Napoleon III today, one of the things that he did was the parks that you see in Paris and all through France, those are Napoleon III. He said that if you created green parks where people could gather, that they would gather in the parks and they would not gather in the pubs and become intoxicated and unable to work the next day. I mean, he has a wonderful essay on why parks and not pubs.
Yeah.
Beautification of flowers, because he said flowers tamed savage minds. that the beauty of flowers and I mean, the man had a lot going for him. They never know where to stop. They never know where to stop. They begin to think they're good.
Question.
Yeah.
Did Maximilian get his fate by firing squad or by the noose?
They firing squatted him. And the story is, historically with the firing squad, you have the 12 guys, one guy has a bullet, the other have blanks. The story is that all 12 guns for Maximilian were loaded. So, you tick off enough people and the rules go out.
Yeah.
I think if I knew I was being shot by the firing squad, I'd be looking at each one of them, wondering where it was going to come from. I guess if all 12 are loaded, it's sort of like, I'm going home.
Yeah. Wow.
It is interesting. It's so funny because the Spanish, when they first went into Mexico, were so very concerned about the distillation of the Spanish language by the local influences and everything. And that whole system of, the Castilian Spanish versus the Mestizo versus the mulattoes and everything. The French go in and do the same sort of thing as opposed to looking at it as the blending of cultures. This idea that where we just sort of happily embraced in this country sort of a smorgasbord of foods and customs, and certainly we all kept, maybe distinct patterns of culture, but we also stole from each other. And, there was such concern in Mexico of not allowing that blending of the native peoples and the Spanish and all those other influences. And yet today, it has blended so well. I wonder if there are still, and there probably are, distinctions between language based on the purity of the Spanish. Probably so. But it's interesting.
I really enjoyed that history. I'm amazed how little I knew of all that. How does that background of independence of Mexico relate to the U.S. taking of Texas and that ongoing, long-running kind of quasi-conflict with Mexico?
I think that what you find is because it's in the 1820s when Moses and Stephen Austin will begin to take settlers into Tejanos, into Texas. And the idea being that they're going to be Mexican citizens. And that's during that same period of time that Father Hidalgo has led that independence movement. Mexico is independent. But you're going to find that it plays well into the United States. And that idea of expansion is that, and maybe it's an American sort of thing, once we have a predominant number of citizens in that region whose culture is certainly much more akin to the culture of the United States. One of the agreements that they made in going in with Moses Austin was that they would all become practicing Catholics, that they would, part of that was the assumption that they would have large families. Well, that wasn't particularly an issue because Southern families tended to be large because of working land, and that they would be loyal to Mexico City. That never really happened. And there's a period of about 10 years there where it wasn't enforced. And when Santa Anna comes to power in the early 1830s and begins to want to enforce that, it played beautifully into those American settlers, those US settlers who were in Mexico going, wait a minute, they're wanting tax money. They're all the stuff that they'd heard from the American Revolution. They're now looking at Mexico and saying, well, they're ruling us absentee. We don't have representation. We're just going to fight for independence. So I think that's a valid point that you raise. It all plays in together. And of course, yet once again, the US initially does not we don't directly intervene. But if you look at the number of people who went from Tennessee and from other parts of the United States to Texas to fight, so it wasn't a direct intervention. It was a pipeline, and we got there.
Yeah, we tacitly fought the war. Yeah.
We did. I love to tell my Texas cousins, we are not only kin this way, but Texas and Tennessee are cousins. We are forever united in that fight for independence. And certainly there were people from other regions, but the Tennesseans, I always figured
And-
those guys who were farming needed an excuse to go anywhere to not be home with those 13 kids plowing fields. So, there's a war coming up. Sign me up. I'm volunteering. I think that's probably how my family got to Texas so early. Is they went and I need to go fight for independence. I'm gone.
North Carolina also contributed.
Yes, they did. Well, the North Carolinians and the Tennesseans are one and the same because we were cut from the same cloth since we were originally Western Carolina.
That's right.
The first real Tea Party in the American Revolution occurred in North Carolina. North Carolina women are strong. In Edenton, there was a group of about 20 women that got together and burned all of the tea and swore they would never drink tea again until the colonies were free, prior to the Boston Tea Party. It's really kind of a cool story. But anyway,
And then they put ice in it, didn't drink it hot.
you can always tell those of us who drink our tea with a little bit of cream and sugar haven't let go yet. There's still a bit of the old country there.
Or coffee.
Yeah.
You do the same thing to coffee.
I have to have stuff in my coffee. I'm sorry, I'm a sissy. I need
Me too.
creamers. You all are wonderful. Thank you so much for being here today. 527, Christine.
Wow.
Cheers.
That's amazing.
Yay!
I was good. I was so good. I love that you did this because I can't think of a lot of significant dates or holidays, so to speak, where a lot of people don't really understand. Because I think I've always felt like most people think it's the independence from Spain, and I've always thought that was strange, like how so many people know the date but not the actual reason. Yeah.
Is it a good excuse to toast?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't need a reason to have a margarita, but I don't know about anybody else.
I bet if you did a survey, most people would say it was Mexican independence from Spain, and they would not realize that it was really their second independence, this time from France. Kind of like we celebrate, the Star Spangled Banner is our second great American Revolution. Right. It's the defeat of the British at Fort McHenry. But yet we use it to symbolize all of our wars of independence. And I think it's sort of, Cinco de Mayo is sort of morphed into that for those of us who see Mexican history from a distance. I don't think I knew it in college. I don't remember ever taking Mexican history.
Didn't we go to Mexico one time and Sue during Cinco de Mayo when you?
Mhm.
It's really a treat to do Mexico on Cinco de Mayo in a place called Puerto Vallarta.
Parades and horses and colorful clothing. Yeah, one time we did that.
I'm thinking, I keep saying, folks, when things are better, we need to get us a bus, maybe not from Puerto Vallarta. We need to get a bus and just sort of do a traveling history program. Good plan.
There we go.
I camp. I have sleeping bags. Yay!
We've got library cargo vans. No seats, but
we could even build bookshelves on the side so that when we're traveling and there's not anything to look at, we can be reading.
Oh, there we go. Yeah.
Or
I'm
you
never
can-
short of anything to read.
That's the highway to heaven.
Oh, goodness.
Thank you all so much. See you next
Thank
week.
you.
Enjoy your week. Show up on Friday if you're downtown and you're not participating in the Armed Forces Day Parade. Remember that it begins at MLK and goes all the way to basically 3rd Street will break off, but we have 136 entries. Wow. We're going to be celebrating those who are currently serving, our patriots. We will be recognizing our veterans, and we're just going to be having a party because who doesn't love a parade?